One of Donald Trump's top economic advisors, Larry Kudlow, has acknowledged that the president has been wrong to assert that the US tariffs on imports from China are paid by Beijing. President Trump has recently tweeted that tariffs paid by China since the trade war began nearly a year ago had to help boost the US economy. Last Friday, he doubled tariffs on $200 billion of imports from China. Well, let's get more on this with our Washington correspondent in Washington, Chris Butler. Chris, just how embarrassing is this admission for the president?
Well, I think it's in some ways inevitable. The White House, of course, is trying to focus on the message that trade talks are continuing. If you listen to Larry Kudlow today, the White House economic advisor, he was pointing out and playing up the potential of Presidents Xi and Trump meeting next month in Japan for a G20 summit, whenever they could discuss some of these issues. But actually, Larry Kudlow was also forced to admit that some of the conversations that had taken place during negotiations at the end of last week in Washington actually just covered the same old ground. There was no breakthrough. And at the heart of this disagreement are issues about how China forces foreign companies to operate in the country, rules and restrictions about intellectual property, forcing the sharing of information and technology, for example. Those are all things America wants to try to change, and it also wants to be in a position to ensure that all of that agreement is enforced. But there is no meeting of minds. And meanwhile, the headlines and the concerns for both countries' economies are about the dangers of tariffs being put in place. And as you mentioned there, President Trump did double tariffs, in fact, more than double tariffs on some $200 billion of goods imported from China into the US as those talks were taking place. And he is threatening even more, which he says is bad for China because they will be forced to pay. Except that's not exactly true, as Larry Kudlow was forced to admit when he was questioned by Chris Wallace on Fox News.
Fair enough. In fact, both sides will pay. Both sides will pay in these things. And of course, it depends.
If it's a tariff on goods coming into the country, the Chinese aren't paying.
No, but the Chinese will suffer GDP losses and so forth with respect to a diminishing export market and goods that they may need for their own.
I understand that, but the president says China doesn't. China, it pays the tariffs. They may suffer consequences, but it's U.S. businesses and U.S. consumers who pay, correct?
Yes, to some extent. Yeah, I don't disagree with that. Again, both sides will suffer on this.
And I think the key phrase there is this acceptance that both sides will suffer, that there are dangers to both countries' economies as a result of all of this. And there is the danger that all of this could still escalate, because here in Washington, officials are admitting that they're expecting Beijing to retaliate. And as I mentioned, President Trump has already asked for the paperwork to begin on perhaps yet more tariffs on some $300 billion of Chinese goods, which again could have a danger on both of them. Now, when you listen to Larry Kudlow in that interview, he went on to suggest that actually these risks might be worth taking, specifically to try and get a fair and balanced trade deal. But actually, if you look last week, there are people nervous about this around the world. The wobbles in the stock market showed that. And it does give you an idea that there are people a little worried that these tense talks could end up in a full-blown trade war.